Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove said at 6:19 a.m. when Sarah Chen walked past the nurse's station, her scrubs still damp from the emergency resuscitation she'd performed without waiting for his authorization. He didn't know. None of them knew. 20 years ago, those same hands had pulled a bleeding 8-year-old boy from collapsed concrete in Marjah while 7.62mm rounds punched through the air 3 feet overhead. She'd carried that child 3 miles through poppy fields to an extraction point while her Special Forces team held a defensive perimeter. The boy lived. 17 other civilians in that school didn't. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had been scrubbed from every record, her service erased, her medals locked in a safe deposit box under a name that didn't exist anymore. Now she moved through Sacred Heart's ICU in Savannah with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small mistakes killed people. Hargrove had no idea what he was looking at when he watched her chart her patient assessments. He thought he saw a tired nurse in her mid-40s taking meticulous notes. He didn't see the field medic who had field-sutured a femoral artery bleed in the dark using only a red lens flashlight. What happened next would remind everyone in this hospital exactly who they'd been underestimating. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous frequency above the sterile white corridors of Sacred Heart's ICU. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something underneath it, the copper penny scent of dried blood that never quite washed away no matter how much bleach the housekeeping staff used. Sarah moved between beds with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this 847 times before, or maybe 8,470. The number didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the ventilator on bed 3 that was cycling too fast, the full line on bed 5 that needed repositioning before it infiltrated, and the cardiac monitor on bed 2 that was drifting into occasional premature ventricular contractions. She'd noticed them 17 minutes ago. She'd written them down. 16 minutes after that, the rhythm stabilized. She'd made a note of that too. Kelly, one of the newer nurses, watched Sarah move from patient to patient. The younger woman was smart enough to recognize competence when she saw it, even if she couldn't articulate why Sarah moved through the ICU like a woman navigating familiar terrain in the dark. "You're really good in emergencies," Kelly said, keeping pace with Sarah toward the medication dispensary. "Where'd you train?" Sarah's hands didn't pause as she pulled the patient charts, actual paper charts, something Sacred Heart still maintained alongside the electronic system. The question was innocent enough. Kelly asked it the way you ask someone where they went to high school. Casual. Safe. Long time ago, Sarah said, her voice the texture of still water. Different life. She touched her left wrist unconsciously, where a faded tattoo peered from beneath her watch face, coordinates that officially didn't exist in any military database. 34 degrees, 47 minutes north. 68 degrees, 53 minutes east. Marjah. Kelly didn't ask follow-up questions. There was something in Sarah's tone that suggested follow-up questions were not welcome. The work was meticulous. That was the real problem, though neither Sarah nor Dr. Hargrove understood it yet. Sarah charted patient vitals with penmanship that belonged in a technical manual, each medication timestamp exact to the minute, each observation detailed far beyond what the hospital's standard protocols required. When she documented a patient's response to diuretics, she didn't just write patient responding well. She wrote Lasix 40 mg for administered 0632 hours. Urine output 180 ml by 0715 hours. Creatinine stable at 1.2. Patient alert and oriented, denying shortness of breath, no new orthopnea. The level of detail was methodical. Forensic. It was the kind of charting a prosecutor could use to prove what happened in a patient's care, minute by minute. Dr. Hargrove noticed around 8:15 a.m. when he arrived in his $12,000 Italian shoes, already on his third espresso of the day. He was a man accustomed to commanding attention without earning it, silver hair swept back, Rolex catching the fluorescent light, the kind of posture that came from never being told no by people who mattered. He pulled Sarah's charts from the rack at the nurse's station and his jaw tightened. It was subtle. Kelly almost missed it. Sarah, who was on the other side of the ICU adjusting a patient's oxygen flow, noticed without appearing to notice. She'd learned to read micro-expressions in places where a twitch could mean incoming fire. Hargrove's tension radiated across the ICU like a low-frequency hum. He reviewed the numbers. Patient in bed for admitted with acute heart failure, ejection fraction of 28%. Hargrove's billing code showed 2 echocardiograms, a cardiac catheterization, and a stress test. Sarah's meticulous chart showed 1 echocardiogram. 1. The other tests appeared in the billing system but not in her patient assessment narrative. When she documented findings, she documented what she actually observed. When a test wasn't performed, she didn't pretend it was. By his calculations, Hargrove was looking at approximately $47,000 in documented procedures that his patient chart suggested never happened. And this was just one patient. Sarah's rotation covered 8 beds. She'd been here 3 months. A code blue sounded at 9:42 a.m. The overhead intercom crackled with that metallic voice, "Code blue, bed 6, ICU." The room fractured into controlled chaos. The cardiac arrest team moved with train synchronization. Someone started compressions, someone got the defibrillator pads, someone pushed epinephrine. The monitor showed asystole. Flat line. Nothing. Sarah moved to the bed station where the medications were stored. Her hands didn't shake. A newer resident named Dr. Patterson was running the code, and he was good, crisp orders, no wasted movement, but he was also thinking, processing, calculating. Sarah's hands were already moving on instinct, muscle memory from a life he knew nothing about. She had the 1 milligram epinephrine drawn up and ready before he asked for it. The sodium bicarb was waiting. The amiodarone was staged. It wasn't a request thing. It was having lived in environments where thinking got people killed. 37 seconds of compressions. The monitor ticked. Asystole. 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 Then something shifted in the line, a tiny blip. Patterson called for another round. Sarah had it ready. Compressions continued. 42 seconds. 73 seconds. 104 seconds. And then, sinus rhythm. Actual, genuine electrical activity that meant the heart was beating on its own. The patient's blood oxygen came up. BP flickered into the 60s. Imperfect but alive. The code stabilized. Hargrove stood at the edge of the ICU, arms crossed, watching Sarah. Watching the way she anticipated needs. Watching the way she moved like someone who had done this in circumstances that would have shattered anyone else. "I'm going on break," Sarah said quietly to Kelly afterward, peeling off her gloves with the same precision she'd used on everything else. The statement was almost black humor, the kind only people who regularly stared at death could manage. Exciting Tuesday. Kelly laughed, but it sounded nervous. There was something about Sarah that made people want to laugh nervously. By 11:02 a.m., Dr. Hargrove had made a decision. Not an intellectual decision, an emotional one. Sarah represented a threat to something that mattered very much to him. His income. His reputation. The insurance companies paid him bonuses for billing volume. The more procedures documented, the more billable hours, the better his year looked. He'd been doing this for 17 years, and it had been lucrative for approximately 16 of those years. Sarah's meticulous charting was going to be a problem. The only solution was to make Sarah go away. He gathered his audience at the nurses' station around noon. 5 nurses. 2 residents. 1 nursing administrator named Patricia who always looked like she was calculating the cost-benefit of every conversation. Hargrove smiled. It was the smile he'd perfected over 2 decades of charm meetings with hospital board members. "I'll tell you what," he said, voice pitched to carry across the ICU. "I'll bet $100 Sarah Chen doesn't last a week here." He looked directly at her across the unit, made sure she heard. Made sure everyone heard. This work environment, the pace, the pressure, just isn't for everyone. I give her 7 days. Maybe 8. She'll crack like everyone else. The room was the kind of quiet that happens when someone has just said something unkind enough that everyone feels it but no one wants to acknowledge it. Patricia's face went carefully neutral. Kelly looked at her shoes. Sarah was charting at the medication station, 40 feet away, her back turned. Her hands didn't pause. Her pen didn't waver. She finished writing the medication administration timestamp 06 for 2 hours, Lasix 40 milligrams for, patient tolerating well, and then she set the pen down slowly, the way someone sets something down when they're being very careful about their composure. She turned. Made eye contact. Dr. Hargrove met her gaze expecting to see something, fear, humiliation, anger. What he saw was worse. He saw nothing. He saw the eyes of someone looking at him from across a distance he didn't understand. When Sarah spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only the closest nurses heard it clearly. But in the ICU at midday, with the ventilators cycling and the monitors beeping their electronic rhythm, quiet voices travel. "I've picked up dying children in the dark, doctor," she said. "Your paperwork doesn't scare me." The room went dead silent. The ventilator on bed 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor on bed 2 beeped once. Twice. Hargrove's face had gone pale in a way that suggested he understood, in that moment, that he'd just said something unforgivable to someone he fundamentally misunderstood. He had no idea that 34 degrees, 47 minutes north was where Sarah Chen had earned herself a Navy Cross for pulling 7 wounded from a burning vehicle while insurgent fire shredded the perimeter around her. He had no idea that her personnel file had been redacted by people with authority that superseded hospital administration. He just knew that he'd made a terrible mistake, and the proof was standing right in front of him in navy blue scrubs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sarah had shown him nothing but composure. She'd given him no emotional reaction to amplify or use against her. She'd simply stated a fact, that children had died in her hands, that darkness had been her workplace, that a middle-aged cardiologist and his $100 bet existed in a completely different universe than the one she inhabited. And then she'd gone back to her charting like nothing had happened, like the challenge had already been answered. The Salisbury steak hit the tile at 11:06 a.m., exactly 17 minutes into shift change when the cafeteria reached maximum density. Sarah had been holding the tray with both hands, coffee in the left corner, green beans in a small paper cup, the meat centered on a white plate with a blue rim. Dr. Hargrove approached from her blind side, his elbow angled like he'd been waiting for the moment to line it up properly. The collision wasn't accidental. She felt that immediately. The tray tilted. Food cascaded across the floor in a spreading pattern, gravy pooling around the toe of her shoe, green beans scattering like ammunition across 6 feet of linoleum. The coffee cup shattered. 50 staff members froze mid-chew, mid-conversation, mid-swallow. A resident near the beverage station stopped with a fork halfway to his mouth. Hargrove stepped back, his white coat unblemished. "Clumsy," he said, pitched loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Maybe nursing isn't your calling." Sarah took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from practice, from 20 years of holding position while someone screamed 17 inches from her face, from situations where the wrong exhale pattern could cost lives. She straightened slowly. Her eyes met his. One tear escaped down her left cheek, not from sadness, but from the sheer pressure of everything she wasn't allowed to say, everything she couldn't do without erasing herself completely. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist, never breaking eye contact. Her voice came out low, controlled, like still water running over stone. "I've picked up dying children in the dark, doctor. Your paperwork doesn't scare me." The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of weight, a pressure that pushed down on every throat in the cafeteria. Someone set down a fork. The industrial ice machine hummed in the corner like it was the only thing permitted to move. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His left eye twitched once. He'd expected tears, retreat, stammering apologies, the standard response from someone intimidated by institutional power. Instead, he'd found a woman with the composure of someone who'd survived things the hospital's institutional power couldn't touch. The recognition flickered across his face for exactly 2 seconds before he covered it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "someone's had an interesting life." He turned and walked back to his table, where 2 residents sat pretending they hadn't been watching. The cafeteria noise resumed, conversations restarting, silverware clinking, the sound of normalcy reasserting itself like water closing over a stone. But something had shifted in the baseline radiation of the room. People glanced at Sarah as she knelt and began cleaning every piece of food into a napkin, her movements precise and unhurried. No one helped. Helping would have meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have meant taking a position. Kelly watched from 2 tables over, her expression caught between shock and something that looked like recognition. The next morning brought worse. Sarah was in ICU rounds with Dr. Hargrove, 3 nurses, 2 residents, and the attending cardiologist, Dr. Morrison, who everyone called Doc and who had no idea what was building. They were reviewing morning admissions of a 68-year-old male with atrial fibrillation, a 42-year-old post-op bypass patient, a 73-year-old with decompensated heart failure and a morphine allergy that Sarah had flagged 3 times in the chart because it wasn't matching Hargrove's ordering pattern. Hargrove was dictating orders with the casual authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Continue current cardiac protocol," he said, not looking at Sarah's documentation. "Double the 4 diuretics, I want aggressive diuresis on the CHF patient." He paused. "Actually, triple it." Sarah had already documented that the patient's creatinine was rising, that aggressive diuresis at this rate would push him into acute kidney injury, that the ordering pattern didn't align with current EF measurements. She'd charted it meticulously. Not as a suggestion. Not as a question. As fact. As the kind of detailed observation that made insurance patterns visible to people trained to read them. Hargrove stopped walking. His eyes found her chart in her hands. "That's the one with my notes," he said. Not a question. Sarah raised it slightly. "Yes, doctor." He reached out, gripped the corner of the chart with both hands, and threw it at her feet. Papers exploded across the tile floor of the ICU, patient history, lab results, medication administration records, everything she documented with forensic precision scattering like a confession. The sound was sharp. Clinical. Violent in its precision. "Pick that up," he said. His voice had dropped to the register of an authority that didn't need volume. "And maybe try documenting what I actually ordered instead of playing detective." Doc Morrison's face went pale. The residents looked at their shoes. The 3 nurses, Kelly, Martinez, and Cho, stood motionless with the practiced stillness of people trained to witness without involvement. Sarah's hands trembled for exactly 2 seconds. Not from fear. From the recognition that she was trapped in a pattern she designed herself, that the precision which made her an extraordinary medic made her a liability to a man whose orders didn't match his documentation. The trembling stopped. Her hand steadied. She knelt and began collecting the papers. The fluorescent lights above the patient bed hummed their relentless electronic song. Somewhere in the distance, a monitor beeped, steady, controlled, indifferent. She reassembled the chart with perfect hospital corners, the way she'd learned to fold bandages so they wouldn't unravel under pressure. Every page in order. Every notation visible. Every order he'd given documented exactly as written, which was the problem. She stood and handed it back. "Your orders are documented exactly as written, doctor," she said. Her voice had dropped lower than before, not angry, not confrontational, just stating fact. "That's the problem." Hargrove's face remained composed, but something had changed in his eyes. He'd thrown an institutional weight at her and watched it bounce off like she was made of something more durable than he'd anticipated. He tucked the chart under his arm and continued rounds without another word. Doc Morrison cleared his throat and asked about the bypass patient's post-op pain levels. Normalcy resumed like a door closing. Kelly caught her in the supply room 30 minutes later, after vitals were checked and medications dispensed and the morning cascade of institutional necessity had subsided into temporary stillness. "Why do you let him do that?" Kelly's voice was quiet, her hand reaching for but not quite touching Sarah's arm. Why don't you report him? Sarah stared at the shelves of wrapped gauze and saline bags and sterile gloves arranged in their neat rows like soldiers standing at rest. Because I'm not allowed to fight back, she said. Not an explanation. A statement of operational constraint. That's not fair, Kelly said. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. That afternoon, while Sarah was charting in the break room with a coffee she didn't taste, Hargrove sat in his corner office with the door closed and made 3 phone calls that would set the machinery in motion. The first was to Board Chairman Reynolds, who answered on the 3rd ring and listened without interrupting as Hargrove explained that the new ICU nurse was creating documentation liability, implying clinical judgment errors, potentially exposing the hospital to regulatory review. Reynolds promised to look into her credentials. The second call was to St. Catherine's Hospital in Charleston, where Sarah's resume claimed 3 years of employment. The HR director hesitated, fumbled, mentioned limited records. The third call was to a private investigator named Morrison, $5,000 for a background check, focus on the 15-year employment gap, medical licensing verification, previous addresses, reference checks that went deeper than standard human resources protocol. The machinery was in motion now. It moved slowly, like a surgical robot initializing, but once started, it had its own momentum. That night, Sarah went home to her studio apartment in a converted warehouse near River Street, 1 room, kitchenette, bathroom, furniture that could be packed in under an hour. She opened the locked drawer in her bedside table and removed the faded unit patch, its edges frayed from 2 decades of careful handling. The Special Forces insignia was still visible despite the fading, the dagger, the lightning bolt, the scroll with words that meant she had volunteered for things the civilian world would never understand. She stared at it for 10 minutes. Then she locked it away again and took a sleeping pill and lay in the dark, fully clothed, because old habits don't dissolve just because you wear scrubs instead of combat fatigues. At 2:07 a.m., Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Kelly. Hargrove asked me about your previous jobs today. Are you okay? Sarah didn't respond. She already knew what was happening. She could feel the machinery accelerating, could sense the careful architecture of her invisible life beginning to develop structural weaknesses. The 15-year gap would be discovered. The old facilities would have limited records because the military liaison had scrubbed them carefully, officially, completely. The references would lead nowhere because the people she'd worked for weren't civilian employers and the operations weren't documented in databases that investigators could access. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:53 a.m., paramedics rushed into Sacred Heart's emergency department with a patient, mid-40s, severe blunt force chest trauma, injuries consistent with a high-speed vehicle accident during night tactical training at Hunter Army Airfield. No identification. No wallet. No phone. Just a broken man on a stretcher and a jacket torn at the seams. The ER physician shouted orders for a trauma bay, for an ICU bed, for a chest X-ray and a CT scan. Sarah was working nights. She was in the ICU when they wheeled him past the nursing station, and something made her look up, not a sound, not a voice, just the invisible transmission of presence that comes from recognizing something buried so deep you'd stopped believing it was real. His face was swollen, lacerated, barely recognizable. But his jacket was torn open across the shoulder and sewn inside the lining, the same place where soldiers always put them, where they stay closest to the heart, was a faded unit patch. The same insignia she'd locked in her drawer 17 hours earlier. The same unit she'd served with in Marjah. Sarah's breath caught. Her hands went numb. The chart she was holding slipped and clattered against the counter, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Sacred Heart Hospital, no one was there to notice. The stretcher wheel squeaked against the ICU tile at 4:17 a.m., and Sarah knew before she looked that this was different. The paramedic's voice carried that particular urgency, the kind that meant trauma, meant rush, meant the patient was barely holding the line between here and gone. John Doe, estimated age 28 to 32, severe blunt force chest trauma from a training accident, lost consciousness en route, BP unstable. She moved into the trauma alcove without being asked, already pulling on fresh gloves, her muscle memory overriding everything else. The patient's clothing was shredded, tactical pants, torn undershirt, the remnants of what looked like military-grade body armor that had absorbed most of the impact but hadn't been enough. Sarah cut away the fabric with practiced efficiency, her trauma shears making that distinctive metallic snipping sound that always meant business. His chest was a landscape of contusions, deep purple and angry black spreading across the sternum and ribs. She was already cataloguing injuries, already moving through the assessment without conscious thought, when her blade caught on something tucked into the jacket lining. A patch. Faded. The colors nearly bleached away by time and sun exposure. The 5th Special Forces Group insignia. Marjah. 20 years dissolved in an instant. Her hands went very still. The shears hung suspended above his collarbone for a beat that stretched into something longer. Sarah forced herself to breathe, a single controlled inhalation that no one in the room would notice, and finished removing the jacket. She laid it aside, careful, deliberate, professional. Then she looked at the patient's face. Really looked. The swelling was significant, his left eye sealed shut, his cheekbones fractured, his jaw contused beyond immediate recognition. But underneath the trauma, underneath the years and the damage and the man his body had become, she saw the bone structure of a child. The shape of his forehead. The scar above his left eyebrow, faint but still there after 2 decades, the same scar from where he'd hit a concrete wall during the collapse, before she'd found him, before she'd pulled him from the rubble while the bullet snapped overhead and her team held the perimeter. Marcus Webb. 8 years old, holding onto her neck, whispering "Don't leave me" in Pashto-accented English while her legs burned and her lungs screamed and she ran 3 miles to the evac point. Now his chart read, emergency contact listed as General Webb, U.S. Army. Sarah's vision narrowed to the monitors. His heart rate was already climbing, 110 beats per minute, accelerating. His blood pressure hovered at 98/60, which shouldn't have been that alarming yet, except she could see the trajectory. She could read the story the vitals were telling. His heart was struggling. His lungs were pushing harder. Something inside him was failing, and the numbers made it clear he had minutes before it became catastrophic. "I need a cardiac monitor," she said, her voice level as still water. She was already reaching for the 12-lead EKG pads, already preparing the equipment. A nurse tech moved to help, but Sarah's hand caught his arm. "Now." "And page cardiology." The tech moved. The monitor beeped to life, the green line tracing the electrical activity of a heart that was working far too hard. Muffled heart sounds. She could hear it through the stethoscope, the normal distinct lub-dub degraded into something softer, almost smothered. Distended neck veins stood out like cords. She checked his BP again, manually, the cuff hissing as it inflated and deflated, 88/55 and falling. Cardiac tamponade. She was certain. The impact had ruptured something, or at least torn it enough that blood was accumulating in the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding his heart, compressing it like a fist slowly closing around a beating muscle. Every beat was becoming harder work. Every second brought him closer to the moment when his heart would simply stop. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 4:38 a.m., irritated from the moment he walked through the trauma alcove doors, his irritation radiating off him like heat from a fever. His scrubs were pristine, the man had probably been sleeping, probably had his phone on silent until the page reached him. He didn't like being called in at this hour. That much was visible in the set of his jaw, the way he moved without the fluid purpose of someone trained in emergency medicine. "What's the emergency?" he asked, the question itself implying that whatever it was, it probably wasn't. Sarah pointed at the monitor without turning to face him. She kept her eyes on Marcus's vitals, kept one hand on the 4 line she'd already established in his femoral vein. Muffled heart sounds, distended neck veins, BP falling. His developing tamponade. He needs a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Or a pericardiocentesis if we want to do this right. He has 15 minutes, maybe less. He's stable enough, Hargrove said. She heard the dismissal in his voice before she heard the words. "We'll get an echo in the morning." Sarah's jaw tightened. Not visibly. Just enough that she felt her teeth press together, felt the muscles of her neck engage. She turned to face him now, and her voice had changed, dropped lower, stripped of anything conciliatory. "Doctor, he needs intervention now. His systolic is falling. His heart rate is climbing. This is textbook cardiac tamponade." Hargrove stepped closer, his voice low and precise, the way a predator might speak, controlled, certain of its dominance. "You don't make that call. You're a registered nurse. You follow protocols. And the protocol here is that I make the medical decisions. If you touch this patient without my explicit order, I will file a report with the state medical board that will end your career. Falsified credentials, practicing outside your scope, insubordination. Are we clear?" He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked out of the trauma alcove, his footsteps echoing slightly against the tile. Sarah stood at the bedside, her left hand still on the fall line, her right hand hanging at her side. The monitor continued its steady escalation of alarms, heart rate 117, blood pressure 82/48, the oxygen saturation beginning its own descent. She watched the numbers change, watched the green line tracing patterns that spelled out a story nobody in this hospital would be allowed to read until it was too late. Marcus's eyes fluttered open for a moment, a brief window where consciousness tried to surface. His gaze was unfocused, swimming, the way eyes moved when the brain was already beginning to starve for oxygen. His lips moved. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a ghost of sound that only she could hear. "Tell Chen. I made it." Then the lids closed again, and he slipped back under. His BP dropped to 78/43. The heart rate climbed past 120. The alarm became insistent, urgent, a sound that meant the body was shutting down in real time, and somewhere in the hospital, in an office or a call, or in his bed, Dr. Hargrove was making phone calls. She could feel them happening, could sense the machinery of institutional power beginning to move against her. She'd seen it before, the way hospitals protected their own, the way powerful men with favors called in debts and reputations, the way systems were designed to shield the corrupt from the consequences of their choices. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew exactly what she needed to do, and she also knew precisely what it would cost her. The monitor's alarm screamed. And there was no one left to answer it. The monitor's alarm screamed. And there was no one left to answer it. Sarah moved before the sound completed its third pulse. The cardiac tamponade wasn't a theory anymore, it was arithmetic. Marcus Webb's systolic pressure had dropped 16 points in 4 minutes. His jugular veins distended like rigid cables beneath the skin. His breathing had shifted to the shallow, desperate pattern she'd seen in field hospitals where the ceiling was corrugated metal and the floor was dust and blood. Pulses paradoxus. Muffled heart sounds. The textbook diagnosis that meant his pericardium was filling with fluid, compressing his heart like a fist closing around a bird. She didn't call Hargrove again. The pericardiocentesis kit sat in the crash cart where it belonged, 14-gauge angiocath needle, 60-milliliter syringe, sterile drapes, betadine swabs. Equipment she'd assembled in darkness, in blown-out clinics, in the back of Hums careening through Helmand Province with rounds snapping overhead and her hands steady because steady hands kept people alive. Muscle memory wasn't something you learned in nursing school. It was something that lived in your fingers after you'd done it enough times that hesitation wasn't an option. She prepped his skin. Subxiphoid approach, angled 30 degrees toward the left shoulder, exactly as she'd been trained 2 decades ago when the training was classified and the rooms had no windows. The needle penetrated the pericardial sac with a distinctive give that meant she'd reached the membrane, a sensation like pushing through silk that had been stretched over a frame. The syringe filled immediately. Bloody fluid. Dark red. 60 ccs. 70. 80. His blood pressure climbed from 74 to 92 in the space of her next breath. His heart rhythm stabilized. The chaos on the monitor reformed into organized sinus rhythm, organized, regular, alive. His eyes opened. Clear this time. Present. You're safe, she whispered, fingers on his carotid pulse to confirm what the monitor showed. "You're safe, Marcus. You're back with me." He stared at her, confused and sedated, unable to understand why his body suddenly felt like it belonged to him again. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. No tremor. No hesitation. Just the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this while mortar fire hammered the walls and counted the seconds until medevac arrival. The procedure took for minutes and 12 seconds. Dr. Hargrove returned 10 minutes later. He came through the ICU doors with the on-call resident trailing behind him, both still in the business of ignoring Sarah's warning signs, still in the headspace where they were right and she was wrong. Then Hargrove's eyes found the crash cart. The procedure kit laid out in perfect order. The syringe with its residual bloody fluid. The sterile field still marked around Marcus Webb's subxiphoid area. His face went the color of old concrete. "What the hell did you do?" Not a question. An accusation with teeth. Sarah met his eyes. Her voice came out steady as a surveyor's level. "I saved his life. Cardiac tamponade, exactly like I said. Another 5 minutes and he'd have arrested. He needed intervention. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization." Hargrove's voice climbed. "You're beyond your scope. You're done. Security. Now." She didn't argue. Arguing required believing there was a conversation worth having. Security arrived in 4 minutes. 2 uniformed officers who'd never made eye contact with her in the cafeteria line suddenly had instructions to escort her from the building. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song as she walked the corridors toward the administrative wing, past the break room where other nurses pretended not to watch, past the supply closet where she'd sterilized instruments, past the window where she could see the Savannah skyline trying to exist beyond walls that suddenly weren't hers anymore. Human resources occupied the 4th floor in rooms that smelled like recycled air and disaster. Director Paulson sat behind a desk with her nameplate and her visible discomfort, looking at Sarah like she'd become something complicated in the span of an afternoon. "Dr. Hargrove is filing formal charges of insubordination and practicing beyond your scope," Paulson said, reading from a document that had probably been drafted in the 10 minutes between Sarah's procedure and this moment. "We have to suspend you pending investigation. Your hospital credentials are under review. You can't work in any capacity until this is resolved." Sarah signed the papers without reading them carefully. What was there to read? The language was standardized. The outcome predetermined. A physician with connections and a nurse with no one to call. The mathematics of institutional power solved itself. By morning, Hargrove had activated his entire network. Board Chairman Reynolds received a call. His secretary would later report he took it in his office with the door closed. Morrison, the investigator, the one Hargrove kept on retainer for exactly these moments, began pulling files. Every hospital where Sarah had worked. Every credential listed. Every reference who might be confused or pressured or persuaded to remain conveniently unavailable. And the detail that would become the foundation for everything else. Before 2008, there was nothing. No college transcripts. No previous addresses. No employment history. Like Sarah, Chen hadn't existed until 15 years ago. Like she'd been born at 32 years old with advanced nursing credentials and no paper trail. "Her employment history is weird," Morrison reported back to Hargrove by phone. "Before 15 years ago, nothing. She's got a nursing degree from Johns Hopkins dated 2006, but I can't find her in any nursing program databases. No social media before 2008. No utility bills in any name before that year. Either she's got serious fake credentials, or someone erased her from the system intentionally." Hargrove smiled. He understood erased. He understood the kind of power that could make a person disappear from institutional memory and then reappear exactly when and where it was most destructive. He filed a complaint with the state nursing board alleging fraudulent credentials. Within 48 hours, Sarah received termination papers, not resignation, not separation, termination, and formal notice that the state board was investigating whether her nursing license had been obtained through falsified documentation. The language was clinical and devastating. The implications were absolute. She cleaned out her locker at 2 a.m. on a Friday when the night shift was too busy to watch. Kelly found her standing in front of the open metal door, staring at the uniform scrubs folded in the cubicle and the photograph she'd never pinned to the door because photographs told stories and Sarah Chen's stories weren't meant to be told. "This isn't right," Kelly said, voice shaking. "Sarah, this isn't right. Hargrove set this up. Everyone knows he." "It's done," Sarah said. Not bitterness. Not anger. Just the voice of someone who had already calculated the odds and accepted the math. Security walked her out at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. The front entrance of Sacred Heart Hospital, the same doors she'd walked through with her badge and her credentials and the careful invisibility of someone meant to heal but never be noticed. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, engine off, looking at the hospital logo on her parking pass and the impossible choice between driving home and driving nowhere. She drove to the VA hospital on Eisenhower Drive instead. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and catastrophe. 20 veterans occupied the plastic chairs, amputees in wheelchairs, PTSD 1,000-yard stares, combat burns that hadn't healed because they weren't the kind of wounds that healed. She recognized 2 faces from field hospitals she'd run in places that didn't exist on maps. Neither recognized her. A woman who'd worked in the darkness for 2 decades looks like everyone and no one. She filled out intake forms with her right hand. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint. The accumulated weight of keeping quiet while the system dismantled you for saving a life. The nurse at intake was kind and oblivious and too busy with the catastrophe in front of her to notice that the woman in the corner had done more before breakfast than most soldiers did in a career. The television played morning news on mute. Then the windows rattled. Not car alarms. Not the distant sound of traffic. The sound that soldiers recognize in their bones because it's the sound of power arriving without apology. Rotor wash. Heavy. Rhythmic. Growing louder. The kind of mechanical percussion that meant Black Hawks and the kind of Black Hawks that meant something official was about to happen. For helicopters descended onto the hospital's main helipad. The waiting room moved as one organism toward the windows. The military convoy had already begun blocking the main entrance, 3 Hums positioned like sentries, 2 armored SUVs nose-to-nose with the entrance. Uniformed soldiers establishing a perimeter that said this wasn't a request and wasn't negotiable. The automatic doors opened. A SEAL team commander entered first. Dress uniform. Combat ribbons in perfect rows. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He was flanked by 6 operators in identical dress, and the room understood instinctively that these were men for whom violence was an alphabet they'd spoken fluently for decades. They moved through the waiting room like apex predators in human form, their boots sounding on the linoleum floor like a countdown. The SEAL commander approached the intake desk. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Chen," he said, voice like a radio transmission, clear, authoritative, not a request. "Call sign Reaper 6. Navy Special Warfare." "Where is she?" The desk nurse stammered something about protocols and privacy regulations, but her hands were shaking because even veterans knew that when Black Hawks landed on your roof and SEAL operators walked into a waiting room asking for someone by a call sign, the someone in question had stopped being a civilian several minutes ago. Every head in the waiting room turned. Sarah stood slowly. The intake form fell from her hands. Around her, veterans saw the moment something shifted in her posture, the spine straightening, the shoulders settling, the 1,000-yard stare that had nothing to do with trauma and everything to do with recognition. They saw her and they understood they'd been sitting next to something they couldn't name. The waiting room parted. Then the doors opened again. General Marcus Webb entered the hospital on his own 2 feet despite the cane, despite the bandages visible beneath his dress uniform, despite the fact that by every medical standard he should have been sedated for another 48 hours. His general's stars were visible on his shoulders. His voice was parade ground strength when he spoke. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen," he said. The desk nurse picked up Sarah's intake form with trembling hands. She read the first line aloud. Then her voice broke. "Oh my God." A Marine Corps liaison officer stepped forward. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor for combat actions in Helmand Province. An Army colonel added, Silver Star for pulling 7 wounded personnel from a burning vehicle in Marjah, 2004. The SEAL commander's voice rose, Navy Cross for an operation in Kandahar that officially never happened. For holding a defensive position for 40 minutes under sustained enemy fire while evacuating 16 civilians. Marcus Webb moved to stand directly in front of Sarah. His eyes were wet. His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear it. "And in 2003, in Marjah, you carried an 8-year-old boy 3 miles to an evac point after pulling him from a collapsed school. That boy was me." The waiting room was frozen. Then General Marcus Webb, U.S. Army Special Forces, slowly lowered himself to one knee before her. Sarah's face crumpled. And Dr. Hargrove, who had followed the commotion from the administrative wing where he'd been meeting with VA brass to coordinate Sarah's final discreditation, stood in the doorway watching his career become mathematics and understanding that he had made a calculation error that would spend the rest of his life being corrected. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. Sarah sat in a mold plastic chair that had held 10,000 people waiting for diagnoses they didn't want to hear, and she was one of them now. 3 days. That's how long it had taken to go from saving a general's life to sitting in a Veterans Affairs hospital waiting room with trembling hands she wouldn't let anyone see. Not trembling from fear. From restraint. The kind of trembling that comes when you've held yourself together through things that would shatter most people, and suddenly the pressure valve opens. Around her, veterans in various states of healing read outdated magazines or stared at walls. A man with an above-knee prosthetic read a Tom Clancy novel. An older woman in a faded Army PT shirt worked through a crossword puzzle with methodical precision. Nobody looked at Sarah. Nobody knew that the quiet nurse in the civilian clothes sitting 4 chairs down from the window was the reason one of their generals was still breathing. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Kelly at Sacred Heart, "Don't answer any more calls from the board." Hargrove's people were still calling, still trying to build a case, still operating as if they had institutional power. They didn't know that power was about to redistribute itself at a federal level. Sarah turned the phone off. The VA waiting room hummed with the white noise of fluorescent lights and the soft beep of a cardiac monitor somewhere in the back. She closed her eyes. The anxiety wasn't clinical, it was the crash that comes after adrenaline drains. 15 years of running on compartmentalization and duty, 15 years of suppressing the weight of classified operations and buried records, 15 years of pretending to be someone smaller than she was. The firing had cracked the container. Everything was leaking out now. That's when the sound changed. The rotor wash hit the hospital first, a deep, rhythmic thunder that made the windows rattle in their frames. Not one helicopter. Multiple. The waiting room went quiet. A veteran with PTSD triggered by noise reached for his wife's hand. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The sound was unmistakable, UH-60M Black Hawks, probably 4 of them, landing on the helipad with precision that meant military, which meant official, which meant something was moving faster than she'd anticipated. Tires crunched in the parking lot below. Truck doors slammed. Not gentle. Command presence. The kind of sound that makes civilians instinctively step back. Then the VA entrance doors burst open. General Marcus Webb walked through first, and Sarah's breath caught in a way she hadn't allowed herself since the moment she'd saved his life. He was awake. Standing upright despite the cane, despite the cardiac surgery incision still healing under his uniform, despite the fact that 6 days ago she'd had her hands inside his chest cavity performing a procedure that had no authorization and no safety net. His dress uniform was immaculate. His jaw was set. Behind him came a SEAL team commander in operational gear, followed by 2 other operators in digital camouflage, and then, FBI. 2 agents in dark suits carrying tablets. The waiting room had maybe 30 people in it. Every single head turned. "Where is Senior Chief Chen?" the SEAL commander asked. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. The authority in it was the kind that comes from leading men into situations where hesitation means death. He was maybe 40, built like a tank with the bearing of someone who'd spent the last 20 years making impossible decisions. The VA nurse at the front desk stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. Sarah rose. Her legs were steady. That surprised her. Everything else was falling apart, but her legs were steady, and her hands were steady, and when she moved toward the commander, she moved like she always moved, like someone accustomed to responding to orders in the dark. "I'm right here," she said. The commander's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. It wasn't a question. He said it like he was confirming a fact that had just been declassified, which of course it had. Behind him, General Webb stepped forward and extended his hand. His grip was firm. Too firm, it cost him something. Sarah could see the micro wince, the way his left shoulder tightened. "Senior Chief." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been waiting 20 years to thank you. I didn't remember your face from Marjah. I was 8 years old and covered in dust, but I never forgot what you did." The waiting room had stopped existing. There was only this moment, this conversation, this thing that had lived in the dark for 2 decades suddenly standing in the fluorescent light with a hospital full of witnesses. "I did my job," Sarah said. It came out in her voice, the one she'd been using for 15 years. Deferential. Small. But something in her chest was cracking open, and the voice underneath, the real voice, was rising. The SEAL commander stepped closer. He had a tablet in his hands, and when he spoke, every word was a drop of water on stone. 2 bronze stars with valor. He showed her the first citation. Her name. Her unit designation. A redacted operation. Silver Star. The second citation. The names of the soldiers she'd saved listed below hers. And a Navy Cross. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. The Navy Cross. The third highest military decoration. People died trying to earn what she'd already carried for 2 decades in a classified file that technically didn't exist. Sarah's vision blurred for a moment, not tears. She didn't do tears in public, but close enough that she had to control her breathing. "The operation that brought that medal has been declassified as of 0600 this morning," the commander continued. His tone was factual, but she could hear the respect underneath, the weight of knowing exactly what she'd done in that operation and why it had never existed in the first place. 7 wounded extracted from a burning vehicle in Marjah. Under fire. 2 operators killed after you were clear. Your actions prevented a total casualty count of 9. He paused. You were gone before the after-action report. We never got to list your name in the official record. That changes today. The veteran with the above-knee prosthetic had stood up. The woman with the crossword puzzle was standing. By the time the SEAL commander finished speaking, everyone in the waiting room was on their feet. Not applauding, they knew better than that. Silent. The kind of tribute that comes from people who understand what it means to carry something no one else knows about. That's when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He'd been in a meeting with the VA hospital administrator on the 3rd floor, probably still trying to arrange Sarah's formal termination, probably still operating under the assumption that his network was sufficient to bury a single nurse's career. His face went pale. Not the pale of someone surprised. The pale of someone watching mathematics collapse in real time. 2 FBI agents peeled away from the group around Sarah and walked straight toward him. The lead agent was a woman with gray at her temples and the kind of eyes that had seen corporate crime at scale. "Dr. Richard Hargrove," she said. "We need to speak with you regarding fraudulent documentation and federal wire fraud involving national security protocols." Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. His hand reached for the door frame to steady himself. "I don't know what you're talking about." The second agent, a man built like a linebacker, opened his tablet. You filed a complaint with the state nursing board claiming Sarah Chen falsified her nursing credentials. You hired a private investigator named James Morrison to verify those claims. You then submitted forged documentation to the hospital board. What you didn't know is that Senior Chief Chen's entire service record is classified under Title 50, Chapter 32 of the Federal Code. When you attempted to access her background information through civilian databases, you triggered alerts in 3 different federal agencies. When you falsified documents claiming she lied about her qualifications, you committed federal document fraud. When you contacted the board with false information, you committed wire fraud across state lines. The agent paused. Each count carries a felony charge. Hargrove's knees actually buckled. His hand slipped on the door frame. I was protecting the hospital. She performed an unauthorized procedure. That saved a general's life, the female agent interrupted. While you deliberately delayed intervention. We've interviewed the nursing staff at Sacred Heart. 3 nurses report you've blocked urgent care recommendations before when patients didn't fit your billing protocols. We've also discovered your insurance fraud scheme, inflated billing codes for cardiac procedures that weren't medically necessary, kickbacks from device manufacturers, falsified patient records. Sarah Chen's meticulous charting was about to expose the entire operation. That's why you needed her gone. General Webb stepped forward. His voice was quiet, which made it more devastating. You tried to destroy the woman who saved my life. Because she was too competent. Too honest. He paused. I remember that now. The first thing I remember is her voice in Marjah, telling my operators she had me, telling me to hold still, telling me I was going to be okay. That voice saved my life twice, once in Afghanistan and once in her ICU when you were trying to run her off. The handcuffs came out smooth and practiced. The female agent read him his rights in a voice like a legal document coming to life. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The rest of the waiting room watched in silence as FBI agents escorted Dr. Richard Hargrove past 60 veterans and their families, past nurses and orderlies, past the people he'd intimidated and threatened and bullied for 15 years. As they walked him toward the exit, every single person in that waiting room stood. Not for him. For Sarah. For the principle that competence and integrity matter. For the idea that the people who hold the line don't always get recognized in the moment, but they do eventually. The news cycle picked it up by that evening, decorated Navy SEAL medic targeted by corrupt hospital administrator. By midnight, Morrison the investigator was giving federal agents everything, recordings of Hargrove's calls, emails outlining the fraud scheme, documentation of 8 other staff members Hargrove had forced out when they'd questioned his billing practices. By morning, board chairman Reynolds had resigned. By Friday, Hargrove's medical license was suspended pending permanent revocation. The entire cardiac billing department at Sacred Heart was under federal audit. 2 years passed like pages turning in a book that had finally been allowed to continue. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The Hall of Heroes. The kind of room where history lives in the walls. Sarah Chen stood in dress Navy uniform, her actual uniform, the one that had been scrubbed from official record and was now being restored to the light, while the Secretary of Defense read her citations aloud. 200 people in the audience. General Marcus Webb stood beside her, now commanding Special Operations Task Force South. His uniform had 2 more medals than it did 2 years ago. Directly behind them, mounted in a double frame of black walnut, hung the faded unit patch from his jacket and 2 citations side by side, his, for Valor in combat operations, hers, for extraction under fire and 6 other classified missions now declassified. In the back row, Kelly from Sacred Heart sat with 12 other ICU nurses from Sacred Heart Hospital who'd driven up together in a hospital van. They wore scrubs under their civilian clothes. The kind of quiet tribute that tells you something about community and respect. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Sarah what was next. She looked at General Webb, who nodded, the same nod he'd given her 1,000 times in different contexts, in different countries, across 20 years that had officially never happened. I'm going back to nursing, she said. But this time, they know who I am. The camera cut briefly to a community college classroom, afternoon light slanting through windows that had seen better days. Dr. Hargrove stood in front of a CPR dummy, demonstrating chest compressions to 8 bored students. His hands shook slightly. His voice was thin. No one asked him questions. No one listened when he spoke. Then the final shot, Sacred Heart Hospital, ICU corridor, the blue-gray light of early morning before the shift fully wakes. Sarah walked through with a patient chart in her hands and a small unit patch pin on her scrubs, not the faded one, but the restored original, framed and mounted at home. Every staff member she passed straightened. Not from fear. From something deeper. Recognition. Respect. Understanding. Kelly handed her a chart. Room 7 needs assessment. Sarah nodded and headed into the unit, moving with the quiet precision of someone who'd carried impossible weight and didn't break under it. Behind her, the unit patch on her scrubs caught the light. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the people who hold the line often do so in silence, then subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories of the quiet warriors who change everything. And comment, tell us about someone you've underestimated who turned out to be far more than you assumed. Your story matters too.